In 1941, the world witnessed an aircraft so deadly, so precise, and so advanced that it seemed to have no equal. Its name, Zero. A Japanese fighter that flew farther, maneuvered better, and won nearly every battle. But as the war went on, it went from being an unbeatable aircraft to a flying coffin. Today you'll understand why the Americans panicked when they first saw the Zero, how it was designed to be perfect, and why that obsession with perfection became its greatest flaw. How did a fighter with no armor and little protection become the most feared weapon in the Pacific? You'll learn about the real-life episode that turned the tide of the air war, the story of the Zero captured in Alaska, the decisive clashes with the F-6F Hellcats, and the moment the Zero stopped hunting and became the hunted. A6M Zero from glory to defeat. A brief context. In the 1930s, the world was living under a false sense of stability. The First World War had ended, but the tensions merely changed form. Europe was sinking into economic crises, Nazism was gaining strength in Germany, and the United States was still trying to recover from the Great Depression. In the far east of Asia, Japan was taking a different path, growing increasingly aggressive, expansionist, and determined to become the dominant power in the Pacific. Driven by a nationalist and militarist ideology, Japan invaded Manchuria in 1931 and declared full-scale war on China in 1937. For the Japanese military, war was inevitable, and air superiority would be decisive. The mission to build this machine was entrusted to Mitsubishi Heavy Industries. Mitsubishi was already a pillar of Japan's war industry, with extensive experience in producing ships, engines, and military aircraft. Its aviation division gathered the country's most capable engineers and maintained direct ties with the Naval High Command. It was there that the name destined to change the skies over the Pacific emerged, Jiro Horikoshi, a young engineer who took charge of the project. The requirement was clear. The new fighter had to be the lightest, most agile, and have the longest combat range ever seen. To achieve this, they had to give up armor, self-sealing fuel tanks, and even pilot protection, sacrificing safety for performance, results before lives. The aircraft received the designation A6M, where A stood for a carrier-based fighter, 6 meant it was the 6th model of its kind developed for the Navy, and M indicated the manufacturer Mitsubishi. But the name that went down in history was another, Zero, in reference to the imperial year 2600 or 1940 in the Western calendar, the year it was introduced. By the late 1930s, Japan was already deeply involved in its war against China, but its ambitions went far beyond the Asian continent. Military leaders believed that the country's survival depended on territorial expansion and total dominance over the Pacific. To do that, they would have to face off directly against the Western powers, especially the United States, the United Kingdom, and the Netherlands, who controlled maritime routes and strategic resources in the region, such as oil and rubber. Meanwhile, Europe was plunging into a new war. In 1939, Germany invaded Poland, triggering the Second World War. The following year, Hitler attacked France and pushed into the rest of Europe. Italy and Germany formed the core of the Axis. Japan, already sharing ideology and strategic interests with these countries, formalized its alliance by signing the Tripartite Pact in September 1940, forming the Rome-Berlin-Tokyo Axis. With the United States still out of the European war, Japan saw an opportunity. If it acted quickly in the Pacific, it could seize valuable territories and establish an empire, while the Allies were distracted in Europe. But the plan was threatened by economic sanctions imposed by the Americans and their allies. Without access to oil from the Dutch East Indies and steel from the US, Japan found itself cornered. This was unsustainable pressure for a war machine that consumed resources at an accelerated pace. The Imperial Navy then planned an offensive starting with Pearl Harbor, aiming to destroy the American fleet in the Pacific, followed by rapid advances into the Philippines, Malaysia, Hong Kong, and other strategic regions. The idea was to secure this empire with a defensive line impossible to breach. But there was one condition for success: air superiority from the very first moment. Aircraft carriers would be the heart of the operation, and the Zero fighter its deadliest weapon. The birth. Before the Zero emerged, Japanese aviation was already evolving rapidly, especially in naval aviation. Since the 1920s, Mitsubishi had been manufacturing fighters such as the A6M Claude, the world's first successful carrier-based monoplane fighter, which performed well in the war against China. But the A6M was starting to show its age. Its speed, range, and firepower would not be enough against modern American, British, or Soviet fighters. It was in this context that, in 1937, the Imperial Japanese Navy issued a new technical requirement known as the 12 Shi, requesting a next-generation fighter. The requirements were nearly impossible. The aircraft had to reach at least 500 kilometers per hour, have endurance of more than 6 hours of flight with auxiliary tanks, climb to 3,000 meters in 9 to 10 minutes, and still maintain agility superior to any other fighter in the world, all while operating from aircraft carriers, typically implying a heavy aircraft with reinforced landing gear and folding wings. But Japan wanted exactly the opposite: extreme lightness, range, and maneuverability, a walking contradiction. Nakajima withdrew soon after, deeming the project unfeasible. Only Mitsubishi accepted the challenge. Under the leadership of engineer Jiro Horikoshi, a team was assembled in Nagoya to create something entirely new. Constructing the Zero required entirely new solutions. To reduce weight, Horikoshi used an ultralight aluminum alloy called extra super duralumin, derived from techniques learned from German engineers in previous years. The entire fuselage was designed to optimize airflow and minimize drag. Retractable landing gear, a novelty by Japanese standards, was introduced, and the cockpit offered excellent visibility, something vital for air combat. Unlike Western aircraft, which were beginning to adopt armor panels and pilot protection, the Zero had none of that. There were also no self-sealing fuel tanks. This made the aircraft lighter, but far more vulnerable. It was a philosophy centered on the idea that the best defense was the perfect offense, winning fast and lethally before the enemy even had a chance to retaliate. The first prototype, designated A6M1, was completed in early 1939. On the 1st of April 1939, the aircraft made its maiden flight at Kakamigahara Field. Test pilot Katsuzo Shima reported extraordinary stability, smooth responsiveness to controls, and excellent flight handling, with performance exceeding nearly all of the Navy's requirements, though the prototype had not yet met the required top speed. Powered by the approximately 780 horsepower Mitsubishi Zuisei engine, the aircraft experienced vibration issues and failed to reach the expected top speed. Only after replacing the engine with the 940 horsepower Nakajima Sakai 12 and equipping a 3-bladed propeller did the model exceed expectations, achieving more than 530 kilometers per hour and an operational range surpassing 3,000 kilometers. After adjustments, the A6M2 Type 0 Model 21 emerged as the initial production version. Its armament consisted of 2 Type 99 20mm cannons mounted in the wings and 2 Type 89 7.7mm machine guns in the nose, giving the Zero firepower sufficient to down-bomb Age fighters. The aircraft's total combat weight was under 2,800 kilograms, a remarkable achievement for a long-range, heavily armed fighter. The A6M0 represented the pinnacle of Japanese engineering of the period, bold, efficient, and unafraid to break the established norms. Every detail of the Zero embodied an offensive warfare philosophy, where mobility, range, and agility came above all. When it was officially unveiled, its own creators knew they had something revolutionary in their hands, a plane unlike anything in the world, soon to forever alter the balance of aerial power in the Pacific. First flights. When the Zero first entered combat in 1940 over China, enemy pilots had no idea what they were facing. The aircraft would appear suddenly, strike with speed, and disappear before any reaction was possible. It was a machine built to destroy, with almost unbelievable range. This performance would be repeated on a much larger scale the following year. On the 7th of December 1941, the world witnessed Japanese strike power in brutal fashion during the surprise attack on Pearl Harbor in Hawaii, where the A6M0 played a central role. The offensive was launched from 6 aircraft carriers: Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, Hiryu, Shokaku, and Zuikaku. From these vessels, over 350 aircraft took off, including torpedo bombers, dive bombers, and around 79 Zeros, tasked with escorting strike groups and securing air supremacy in 2 waves. The Zero had 2 main missions that day: to protect the bombers and torpedo planes attacking the American fleet, and to eliminate enemy aircraft before they could take off. Targets like Hickam Field, Wheeler Field, Iwo Field, and Ford Island were bombed with precision. The Zeros performed low-level strafing runs, destroying hangars, parked aircraft, and control towers with their cannons. Within minutes, American fighters were wiped out of the skies or never had a chance to take off. The Japanese sank or damaged 8 warships, including 5 battleships. USS Arizona, destroyed by a catastrophic explosion that killed 1,177 crewmen. USS Oklahoma, capsizing after multiple torpedo hits with 429 lives lost. USS West Virginia, California, and Nevada sunk or severely damaged. USS Utah sunk as a target ship with 58 casualties. Other cruisers and destroyers were also hit, along with auxiliary ships and oilers. In total, more than 300 American aircraft were destroyed or damaged beyond repair. The attack claimed 2,403 American lives, including 68 civilians, and wounded over 1,100 others. Japanese losses were minimal. Only 9 Zero fighters were shot down during the attack. For many Americans, that fast maneuverable fighter, bearing the red sun on its wings, became the personification of the new enemy, an embodiment of the shock that hit the United States and the Western world that day. In the following months, the Zero continued its streak of victories, dominating the skies over Malaysia, the Philippines, Hong Kong, Burma, New Guinea, and the Solomon Islands. Allied fighters like the F-4F Wildcat, P-40 Warhawk, and Brewster Buffalo could not match its maneuverability. But slowly, vulnerabilities began to appear. American pilots noticed that while the Zero was deadly, it was also fragile. A single well-placed shot could set it ablaze. It lacked armor and self-sealing fuel tanks. While it excelled in horizontal turns, it struggled in high-speed dives. These observations were accelerated by a pivotal event, the Akutan Zero incident. In June 1942, an A6M was forced to land on an Aleutian island. The pilot died in the crash, but the plane remained almost intact. Recovered by the Americans, it was restored and exhaustively tested. It was discovered that the Zero lost control in steep dives, had low structural strength at high speeds, and carried limited cannon ammunition. Armed with this data, the US redesigned its tactics. Wildcat pilots adopted the boom and zoom strategy: dive in, fire quickly, then climb away, avoiding prolonged dogfights. The Akutan Zero data was circulated in manuals to the entire US carrier aviation force. This tactical shift coincided with the arrival of new Allied fighters such as the P-38 Lightning in 1941 and the F-6F Hellcat and Vought F-4 U Corsair in 1943, all more powerful, armored, and heavily armed. The Zero became easy prey in the hands of well-trained American pilots. Additionally, experienced Japanese aces began to fall, and there was no time or infrastructure to train replacement pilots at the same level. The fighter that had once dominated the skies with audacity was now fighting to survive, and the very enemy it had surprised in 1940 was ready to fight back. Crucial moments. But in the early months of 1942, the A6M Zero seemed unbeatable. It stood at the forefront of a series of lightning offensives that left the Allies in shock. With its long range and unmatched agility, it extended the reach of Japanese naval aviation beyond what any other carrier-based fighter in the world could achieve. It was the guardian of bombers, the hunter of fighters, the symbol of Japanese air dominance. During the Battle of the Coral Sea in May of 1942, Zero fighters escorted Japanese bombers and engaged F-4F Wildcats of the US Navy in intense dogfights. In this operation, the Japanese managed to sink the aircraft carrier USS Lexington, a significant loss for the United States. At first glance, it looked like a tactical victory for Japan. A major warship had been taken out, and the Zeros had done their job efficiently. However, Japan failed to capture Port Moresby, lost the carrier Shoho, and several veteran pilots. In the end, the battle turned out to be a strategic draw that favored the Allies. the first sign that the Japanese advance could be halted. Soon came the battle that would mark the beginning of the end, Midway in June. Although the Zeros shot down many enemy aircraft and continued to show superiority in direct combat, the lack of air cover for their own carriers and the fragility of their coordinated air defense proved fatal. 4 Japanese aircraft carriers were sunk within hours. The Zeros could not stop the American offensive, and although still deadly in the air, began to show they were no longer enough to make up for strategic failures. Next came the Guadalcanal campaign. There the Zero faced a new reality: daily combat, brutal operating conditions, and an increasingly adaptive American Air Force. The F-4F Wildcats began successfully adopting the boom and zoom tactic, avoiding traditional dogfights. But the design's DNA, light, unarmored, built for quick victories, no longer fit the evolving nature of the war. Even so, the Zero remained in use and received new versions, the A6M3 and the A6M5, which brought modest improvements such as more powerful engines, shorter wings for better diving, and redesigned exhausts. But the core of the aircraft remained the same: lightweight, agile, and sacrificing protection for performance. In the campaigns across the Solomon Islands, New Guinea, Marianas, and Philippines, the Zero was still the main Japanese fighter, but no longer dictated air superiority. Japan could no longer replace its pilots and aircraft with the same quality as before. In 1944, Japan placed all its bets on defending the Mariana Islands. This was the so-called Battle of the Philippine Sea, or as it became known among Americans, the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. Thousands of poorly trained novice pilots flew Zeros against massive formations of Hellcats, Corsairs, and anti-aircraft batteries from US Navy carriers. The result was devastating: over 300 Japanese aircraft destroyed in a single day versus only a few dozen American losses. The Zero, once a symbol of superiority, was now being hunted in droves. The Japanese doctrine, which relied on individual skill and honor, collapsed in the face of American mass production, tactical coordination, and overwhelming firepower. Still, the A6M Zero continued flying, continued fighting, not because it was the best aircraft at that point in the war, but because it was all Japan had left. And the next chapter in its story would lead the Zero into a darker, more desperate role. The word kamikaze means divine wind, a reference to the typhoons that saved Japan from Mongol invasions centuries earlier. Now Japanese pilots became the new divine wind, crashing their planes directly into enemy ships. The A6M Zero was one of the most used aircraft in these suicide missions. Because it was light, maneuverable, and had good range, it could carry a 250-kilogram bomb and be launched toward American carriers. Most of these aircraft were modified to carry just enough fuel to reach the target. The pilots knew they would not return. Many were under 20 years old. Starting in 1944, Zero kamikazes caused real damage to the American fleet. Some ships were sunk, dozens were damaged, and thousands of sailors died. The most famous of these operations occurred during the Battle of Okinawa in 1945, when hundreds of Zeros and other aircraft were launched against Allied ships. The number of attacks was so high that on some days, ships had to defend against successive waves of suicide bombers coming from every direction. But even these brutal and fanatical attacks were not enough to change the course of the war. The Allies adapted, developed better radar alerts and anti-aircraft defenses. Many Zeros were destroyed before reaching their targets. The strategy, although devastating in symbolic and human terms, was not militarily sustainable. From elegant fighter to flying coffin, from national pride to human sacrifice. Post-war legacy. Yet even in its final chapter, the Zero left a legacy. To American veterans, it remained respected, a feared and worthy enemy that demanded attention, an aircraft that, even defeated by circumstance, flew to the very end. With Japan's surrender in August of 1945, the A6M Zero ceased combat operations. The last models were either shot down or destroyed in hangars, many still being prepared for kamikaze missions. In Okinawa and around Tokyo, Zeros were found abandoned, burned, or dismantled, ghosts of a war that had ended, but whose scars would last for decades. The Zero did not win the war. On the contrary, it came to symbolize strategic miscalculations and the doctrinal rigidity of the Japanese high command. It was an aircraft built for quick victory. When the war turned into a battle of endurance, industry, and adaptation, it was left behind. Its original design was never meant to last. It was built to strike first, win first, and when that opportunity was lost, so was the Zero. But that does not mean it was forgotten. Over the following decades, the A6M Zero became one of the most studied, respected, and recognized aircraft in military aviation history. Its name stands alongside giants like the Spitfire, Mustang, and Messerschmitt Bf 109. In classic films like Tora, 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 and Pearl Harbor, it appears prominently in combat scenes. In Japanese cinema, it earned even greater reverence in the feature The Wind Rises, which tells the story of its designer Jiro Horikoshi, blending beauty, melancholy, and technical pride. At museums such as the Yushukan in Tokyo, the Smithsonian in the United States, and the Pearl Harbor Aviation Museum, restored Zero aircraft are still on display. Some units have even returned to flight after meticulous restorations by engineers and collectors in the US, Australia, and Japan. Seeing an original Zero soar through the sky at an air show is considered a rare and emotional privilege, even for those who never lived through the war. In video games, flight simulators, and strategy games, the Zero remains ever present. These platforms let players and pilots experience its agility, lightness, and limits. It is a living lesson in how design and military philosophy can merge into a single machine. But above all, the Zero is a reminder that technical brilliance can create either beauty or destruction, that boldness and discipline can win early battles but must adapt to survive, and that in the end, every war machine carries the dreams and the mistakes of its makers. Today, the A6M Zero is no longer an enemy. It is living history, a symbol of Japan's rise, glory, fall, and memory in the Second World War. A legend of the skies that even in defeat never stopped flying in the minds of those who study war. And speaking of war, did you know Brazil created a lethal weapon to defend the Amazon and ended up exporting it worldwide? I'm talking about the Super Tucano, a versatile aircraft that causes serious damage in the right hands. Check out that story next. I'll see you there.